The mountain man was cursed to be alone until the obese girl's laughter broke the spell. The Wyoming Territory in 1823 was a land of extremes, vast and unforgiving, where the mountains stretched like ancient giants guarding secrets that civilization had not yet discovered. It was in these remote peaks that Caleb Stone had built his hermitage, a cabin hewn from pine and stone, perched on a ridge so high that clouds often obscured the valley below. Few men knew of its existence, and fewer still had reason to seek it out. Those who had tried never returned with pleasant tales. Caleb Stone had not always been a mountain man. 20 years prior, he had been different, a surveyor with ambitions, a man with dreams of establishing trade routes through the frontier. He had possessed charm enough to win friends in the territories in the ear of influential merchants in St. Louis. He had even been engaged to a woman named Eleanor, a merchant's daughter with auburn hair and a gentle disposition. But that was before the curse took hold. It began subtly, the way curses often do. His best friend and business partner, James Whitmore, died in a hunting accident. A rifle that should not have misfired, loaded by Caleb himself an hour before. Eleanor broke their engagement shortly after, claiming she could not marry a man marked by such misfortune. Within 2 years, every venture he undertook collapsed. Every relationship he formed withered. Every attempt at building something meaningful crumbled like ash in his hands. The local people began to whisper. Some said he had angered a shaman during an expedition into Crow territory. Others claimed he had desecrated sacred ground. A few suggested something darker, that Caleb himself harbored a darkness that poisoned those around him. The precise origin mattered little. The effect was the same. Caleb became a pariah, a man to be avoided at all costs. By 1823, Caleb had embraced his solitude with the fervor of a penitent monk. He had built his cabin high in the mountains, far from any settlement, far from any human contact that might burden others with his curse. He hunted, trapped, and survived on what the land offered. He read books by candlelight, Aristotle, Shakespeare, and volumes of philosophy he had salvaged from abandoned outposts. He spoke only to his dog, a grizzled mountain cur named Achilles, and to the wolves that sometimes howled in the darkness beyond his fire. Caleb had convinced himself that isolation was not a punishment but a mercy, a way to contain the poison he carried. No one else would suffer because of him. No one else would lose everything because they had the misfortune of crossing his path. It was a noble lie that he repeated to himself each night as he lay in his blankets, listening to the wind moan through the peaks. He was 43 years old, and he believed he would die alone on that mountain, unmourned and unremembered. He did not know that fate had other plans. The winter of 1823 was particularly brutal. Snow fell in quantities that seemed almost malevolent, burying the lower slopes and cutting off the passes that might have allowed for supplies. Caleb had prepared well enough. His stores were adequate, his cabin weathered, but even he felt the weight of the isolation more acutely when the storms raged for days without cessation. It was during one of these storms, on a night when the wind howled like something alive and hungry, that he heard the sound that changed everything. A human voice, crying out in the darkness. Caleb's first instinct was to ignore it. He moved closer to his fire, told himself that it was a phantom born of wind and loneliness, a trick of ears too long deprived of human speech. But the voice came again, more desperate, more distinct. Despite every instinct screaming at him to remain in the safety of his isolation, Caleb found himself rising, pulling on his heavy coat and stepping into the maelstrom. The figure he found, stumbling through the drifts, was barely recognizable as human. Caleb's lantern illuminated a young woman, or girl rather, perhaps no more than 25 or 26, whose face was buried in the collar of a sodden coat, whose breath came in panicked gasps, whose substantial frame was crusted with ice and snow. "Please," she gasped when she saw him, "please, I don't I didn't mean to. The pass, the horse threw me, and I got turned around in the snow." Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Every part of him screamed a warning. This was not a coincidence. This was fate testing him again, offering him another victim to corrupt with his presence. He should turn her away. He should point her toward the valley and let nature take its course. That would be the merciful thing to do. Instead, he found himself wrapping his coat around her shoulders and half carrying her back toward the cabin. Her name was Margaret Ashworth, and she was lost because she was stubborn and foolish in equal measure. She had left the settlement of Fort Bridger 2 days prior, convinced that she could reach her aunt's homestead in the southern valley before a storm arrived. She had been wrong. Her horse had panicked at a sound, a mountain lion perhaps, or a bear, and thrown her into the snow. She'd been wandering for hours, growing colder and more desperate, when she had spotted the faint glow of Caleb's cabin light. Caleb brought her inside, stripped away her frozen clothes with the efficiency of a man accustomed to practical necessity, wrapped her in blankets, and sat her before the fire. He prepared hot broth and forced her to drink it. He worked with the detachment of someone performing an unpleasant duty, his jaw tight, his expression remote. Margaret watched him with eyes that had gradually shifted from panic to curiosity. She was not a beautiful woman. Her face was round, her cheeks full, her body as substantial as her rescuer had noticed. In her own time, she had been made to feel the weight of her appearance as deeply as she felt the cold of the mountain. Yet, as she watched this mountain man work with such careful intensity, she saw only compassion in his actions. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life." Caleb did not respond. He was busy arranging blankets near the fire where she could sleep, keeping his back to her, as if the sight of her might trigger some latent disaster. But as the night wore on, something unexpected happened. The cold and the fear gradually released their grip on Margaret, and her natural temperament, the part of her that had always found humor even in difficult circumstances, began to assert itself. She looked around the cabin at Caleb's meager possessions, at the careful arrangement of books, at Achilles sleeping soundly on a rug near the fire, and she smiled. When Achilles woke and padded over to investigate this strange new presence in his domain, Margaret reached out and let him sniff her hand. The dog, who had known only Caleb's grim company for years, seemed delighted by this new attention. He pushed his head into her palm, and Margaret laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that seemed to fill the small cabin like sunlight, breaking through clouds. Caleb, who had been lying on his bed with his face to the wall, felt something shift in his chest. It was a sensation so foreign, so threatening, that he tried to deny it. But the sound of her laughter echoed in his ears long after she had fallen asleep, and he lay awake until dawn, waiting for disaster to strike. The storm continued for 3 days. Margaret's horse did not return, and the snow showed no signs of abating. Caleb told her plainly that she would need to remain with him until the weather cleared enough to attempt a descent to the settlement. She accepted this news with equanimity, which Caleb found both admirable and deeply unsettling. Margaret was not a quiet house guest. She talked. She asked questions. She seemed genuinely interested in the books he read, in his knowledge of the mountains, in the peculiar existence he had carved out for himself. She did not seem intimidated by his silence or put off by his obvious attempts to maintain distance between them. Instead, she treated his solitude as a problem to be solved, a wall to be gently dismantled rather than respected. She helped him prepare meals, though her cooking was questionable at best, and when she burned the bread on the second day, she laughed so hard that tears streamed down her face. Caleb found himself almost smiling at her description of her own incompetence in the kitchen, a smile that he quickly suppressed. "You should smile more," Margaret said one evening as she helped him repair a section of his roof that the snow had damaged. "You have a kind face when you smile." "I have nothing to smile about," Caleb replied flatly. Margaret paused in her work and turned to look at him directly. "It's not true. You're alive. You have shelter and food and books. You have a dog who adores you." What more do you need?" "I need to be alone," Caleb said quietly. "Why?" The question was sincere, not challenging. Why would anyone choose to be alone? Caleb did not answer. He could not explain the curse to her without sounding insane. He could not tell her that everyone who became close to him suffered for it. He could not make her understand that her very presence in his cabin was already putting her at risk. That night, Margaret became ill. The cold that had nearly claimed her during her journey through the snow had weakened her body, and on the third night of her stay, a fever took hold. She shook with chills despite the heat of the fire, and her eyes grew glassy with delirium. Caleb sat beside her, certain that his curse was already working, that her illness was his fault, that she would die, and he would bear the weight of another death on his conscience. He did not sleep. He sat through the entire night, cooling her forehead with cold water, forcing her to drink broth, watching for any sign of improvement or deterioration. As dawn broke gray and pale through the cabin windows, Margaret's fever finally broke. Her eyes cleared, and she looked up at him with something like wonder. "You stayed with me all night," she said. "Your fever might have killed you," Caleb replied. "I could not let that happen." "Why?" Margaret's question was the same as before, but weighted with new meaning. "If you believe you're cursed, if you believe that being near you brings misfortune, why would you do that?" Caleb stood abruptly and turned away from her. "I did what any man would do." "No," Margaret said softly. "A man who truly believed he was cursed would have let me die. Only a man with a good heart stays through the night with a stranger's fever." He did not respond, but her words haunted him in the hours that followed. The storm cleared on the fourth day. The snow began to melt slightly under the weak winter sun, and the pass became passable. Caleb prepared supplies for Margaret's journey down the mountain. He gave her warm clothes, food, and directions to the settlement. Everything was arranged for her departure. Margaret packed slowly, as if hoping that the process might take longer. On the morning she was to leave, she sat across from Caleb at his rough wooden table, eating the breakfast he had prepared. "Come with me," she said suddenly. Caleb looked up, certain he had misheard. "Come to the settlement," Margaret continued. "You could start over. You could have a different life." "I have the life I chose," Caleb said. "You have a life you think you deserve," Margaret corrected gently. "That's different from a life you chose." "You don't understand," Caleb said, and for the first time, something in his voice cracked. "Everyone I've ever known, everyone I've let close to me, they suffer. My best friend died. My fiancé left me. Business partners faced ruin. I am cursed, Miss Ashworth. Staying with me is dangerous." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to laugh, not the gentle musical laugh Caleb had heard before, but something deeper, more genuine. She laughed until she had to grip the table for support. "You're cursed?" she said between gasps. "By what? By whom? Do you truly believe the universe is so concerned with punishing you that it orchestrated all of these events?" "I know what I've seen," Caleb said stubbornly. "What you've seen is coincidence interpreted through the lens of guilt," Margaret said, and her voice grew serious. "My father was like that. After my mother died, a fever, nothing to do with him, he decided he was responsible for her death. He decided he had done something to deserve her loss. It took him 20 years to realize that sometimes people just die. Sometimes business ventures fail. Sometimes people change their minds. None of it has anything to do with you." "You're very wise for someone so young," Caleb said sardonically. "I've had a lot of time to think," Margaret replied, "especially about people like you, people who hide from the world because they're convinced they'll poison it if they step back into it. My father hid in his room for years. He missed out on everything. And then one day, he realized he had wasted his entire life on a story he had convinced himself was true." Caleb turned away from her, unable to continue the conversation. But when Margaret left the cabin that morning, Caleb found that the old weight in his chest had shifted. For the first time in 20 years, he began to wonder if his curse was something he had created rather than something that had been inflicted upon him. Margaret did not return to Fort Bridger. Instead, she returned to the settlement and sent word back to the settlement of her safe arrival. She also made inquiries about the mountain man who had saved her life. The settlers were reluctant to discuss Caleb Stone, but eventually Margaret pieced together his history. She learned about James Whitmore's death, a genuine accident, tragic but not Caleb's fault. She learned about Eleanor and how she had married a merchant from St. Louis and was living contentedly with 2 children. She learned about the business ventures that had failed because of economic downturns, not because of anything Caleb had done. There was no curse. There was only a man who had convinced himself that he deserved to be alone. Margaret returned to the mountains 3 weeks later with supplies and a purpose. She found Caleb where she had left him, living in his solitude, reading by his fire. She presented him with a choice. He could continue living alone on the mountain, or he could come with her and take a job managing supplies for the settlement. She had secured the position for him through a family connection. Caleb stared at her for a long time. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you laughed the first night I was here," Margaret said. "Or almost laughed. I saw the corner of your mouth turn up when I fell in the snow, and I believe anyone who is capable of almost laughing at someone else's misfortune is capable of joy. You've been punishing yourself for long enough." "What if you're wrong?" Caleb asked quietly. "What if I do bring misfortune?" "Then I guess I'll find out," Margaret said. "But I don't think I'm wrong." Caleb left the mountain with Margaret. Achilles came too, delighted by the prospect of new surroundings and new people to meet. The settlement of Fort Bridger was a rough place in 1824, a collection of log buildings clustered around a trading post inhabited by trappers, soldiers, settlers, and opportunists. It was not a place where a man was immediately accepted, but Caleb's competence and his quiet demeanor eventually earned the respect of the community. He managed the supplies for the trading post with such efficiency that the proprietor soon gave him more responsibilities. He worked with the settlement's merchants on planning expeditions into the mountains. He helped settlers repair their cabins and prepare for the long winters. And in the evenings, he spent time with Margaret. Margaret had a small house, more of a cabin, really, on the edge of the settlement. It was she who had inherited money from an uncle, she who had used it to secure her independence and build a life for herself. It was an unusual situation for a woman in 1824, and the settlement gossiped about her openly. But Margaret seemed unbothered by the gossip, and her confidence gradually infected those around her. Caleb found himself on her porch in the evenings, sitting with her as the sun set behind the mountains. She told him stories about her life, how she had been teased as a child for her appearance, how she had learned to use humor as a shield, how she had eventually realized that the opinions of others mattered far less than her own opinion of herself. She talked about books she had read, about the future she imagined for the territories, about the small dreams that occupied her heart. Caleb listened. For the first time in 20 years, he listened to another person without waiting for disaster to strike. The feelings that developed between them were not the passionate, all-consuming emotions often celebrated in romantic literature. They were something quieter, deeper, built on trust and understanding, on shared meals and shared silences, on the knowledge that they each saw the other truly and chose to remain anyway. One evening, 6 months after Margaret had rescued Caleb from his mountain exile, she asked him a question. "Do you still think you're cursed?" "No," Caleb said, and he meant it. "I think I was afraid, and I interpreted that fear as inevitability." "And now?" "Now I'm still afraid sometimes," Caleb admitted. "But I'm learning to live with the fear instead of letting it dictate my life." Margaret reached over and took his hand. That's all any of us can do. When Caleb proposed to Margaret, he did it not with grand gestures or flowery words, but with characteristic simplicity. They were sitting on her porch on an autumn evening, watching the light turn golden on the distant peaks. He took a small ring from his pocket, silver with a simple stone, nothing remarkable, and he said, "I would like to marry you, if you'll have me. I can't promise you a life without difficulty, but I can promise you that I will face it beside you, not from a distance." Margaret said yes, and she was crying, which made her laugh at herself, which made Caleb smile, that genuine smile that had been so rare on his face for so long. They were married in the spring of 1825, in a small ceremony in the settlement chapel. The Reverend seemed bemused by the union, the substantial woman in white and the grave, scarred man at her side, but he performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity. That autumn, their son was born. They named him James after Caleb's lost friend. James was a healthy, boisterous child who inherited his mother's disposition and his father's steady nature. He grew up listening to his father's stories of the mountains and his mother's laughter filling their home. 2 years later, a daughter was born. They named her Eleanor, offering a small redemption to that memory, transforming it from sorrow into joy. Caleb never did tell Margaret the full truth of what he had believed about his curse, but the very fact that he did not need to explain it, that he could simply move forward into a life of purpose and connection without being weighed down by his own assumptions, that was its own kind of breaking of the spell. In 1845, a young man came to the trading post asking for Caleb's stone. The proprietor, much older now, directed him to a cabin just beyond the settlement's edge. There, the young man found Caleb working on repairs to the roof, his hair now entirely gray, his movements slower but still purposeful. "My name is Thomas Whitmore," the young man said. "I'm the grandson of James Whitmore." Caleb climbed down from the roof and studied the young man carefully. "What brings you here?" "I've been reading my grandfather's journals," Thomas said. "I found entries about you, entries written before his death. I found an apology that he had planned to send but never did. I wanted to tell you that his death was not your fault. The gun malfunctioned. There was an investigation at the time, but my grandfather never blamed you. He regretted that you blamed yourself." Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me that." "Is your wife home?" Thomas asked. "The proprietor mentioned you have a family." "She's inside," Caleb said, and he called out toward the cabin. "Margaret!" Margaret emerged, only slightly slowed by age, still carrying herself with the confident grace that had first captured Caleb's attention. James came out behind her, now a man of 20, working as a trader like his father. Eleanor appeared on the porch, 14 and sharp-eyed. The family listened as Thomas Whitmore shared his grandfather's words from beyond the grave. And when he left the next morning, he carried with him a letter from Caleb, not an apology, but a release. A final acknowledgement that the curse had never been real and that he had wasted enough years believing in ghosts. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains that had been Caleb's both prison and sanctuary, he sat with Margaret on their porch, much as he had done in the settlement all those years ago. "Do you remember that night in the storm?" Margaret asked. "When you thought your curse would kill me?" "I remember," Caleb said. "You saved my life that night," Margaret said, "but I saved yours too. I just did it more slowly." Caleb reached over and took her hand, as he had done so many times before. The gesture was no longer born of fear or uncertainty, but of gratitude and contentment. The curse of Caleb's stone had indeed been broken, but not by magic or redemption or any external force. It had been broken by something far more powerful, the simple act of believing that life was worth living, and that one person could make all the difference in learning to believe it.